I've only read one other author that has captured the essence of Lovecraft, and after finishing The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Lavalle, I can confidently say there is still only one author I've read that has captured Lovecraft. But before I get into the review, let's talk about the hook. What is The Ballad of Black Tom about? Tommy Tester, walking the streets with a guitar case and a flashy suit, uses his musical abilities to put food on the table for him and his father. The problem is, he's not a great musician, but this doesn't sway him in the slightest. And it does get him a gig with a mysterious man, which opens doors to a world of which Tommy could have never dreamed. So what did I think? Before I get into talking about the characters, it's important to talk about what inspired this story, The Ballad of Black Tom. That is the story, the short story titled The Horror at Red Hook by H.P. Lovecraft. If you're not familiar with that tale, well, it's about a detective named Malone, and he is forced to go investigate this mysterious figure called Robert Sudum, and he exists in this novel. In fact, it interacts directly with Tommy Tester, our protagonist. So Malone starts tracking this guy. Some kidnappings are happening. Robert's looking younger. Some strange magic is going on, perhaps, and that takes him to a very, very dark place indeed, as many Lovecraft stories do. So this story, The Ballad of Black Tom, is taking a pivotal moment that happens to Malone in the story and kind of gives a reason behind it from the perspective of Tommy Tester. Let us start with character, and unfortunately, this is the biggest problem of the story because the plot hinges on character development. So let me back up a little bit because we should probably talk about what Victor Lavalle is trying to do here versus what Lovecraft tries to do with his stories. And I'm not trying to say that Victor Lavalle should have tried to do what Lovecraft does with his stories, because I really appreciated what Lavalle is doing because Lovecraft never does it. So Lovecraft, his stories are far more about the events that the characters experience. He doesn't really care or develop any of the characters in his stories. Yes, he gives them backgrounds and appearances and so on and so forth, but you never feel for them. And I don't think that it was ever his intention. They're just a means for him to explore these ideas. Now, Lavalle, on the other hand, with A Ballad of Black Tom, he is starting with character. He's trying to make us feel for this man named Tommy Tester, our protagonist. The problem is, I never did feel for him. I don't feel like Lavalle gave us enough to truly get behind this main character, because tragedy befalls him, and that sets him off on a course of, I don't want to call it revenge, but it pushes the plot forward. But because I never empathized with Tommy Tester, this completely fell flat, and so I was never really invested in his story. And me being a reader of character, it's extremely important, right? And it's kind of funny why I love Lovecraft so much, because he doesn't talk about character. Well, he talks about it, he just doesn't develop it. And so I was really intrigued to see what Lavalle was going to do here, because he was adding more of a modern spin on it, a modern storytelling spin to get you really invested in who these people are. And so more than anything, Lavalle is hitting all the beats, right? He has these black and white beats of this character, giving us his problems, showing a tragedy, showing the consequences of that tragedy. And I'll also mention another thing that Lavalle was playing with that I really did enjoy, and that is playing with our expectations of a protagonist. How characters can change and how sometimes they don't change in the way we expect or want them to. So I really like that, but again, because this entire story, this entire transformation hinges on empathy, it did not work for me. I was never invested in the story. So let's briefly talk about the other POV character in the story, and that is Malone. That is the detective from Horror at Red Hook. So part of me did like this because, again, in Lovecraft stories, you're not really exploring character whatsoever. In this, we got to explore Malone a little bit. We got to see how he perceived the slums of Red Hook, how he perceived the people who live there, and how it affected him personally, to a minor degree. But did it save the story? No, of course it did not. But we do get to see, in a different way, through deeper POV, how Malone's story played out in the original Lovecraft story. So let us talk about the plot next. And this story begins with Tommy's delivering a book to a strange woman who turns out to be kind of a sorceress. She's kind of a typical, I guess, somewhat Lovecraftian character who feels like she's running a cult or delving into some deep, dark magic she probably shouldn't be. And it caught me off guard because it felt so random and out of place in the very beginning of the story. Its meaning is sort of revealed at the end, but I didn't feel like it elevated the story. It didn't add anything to the story that Lovecraft already presented. And of course, it did not relate so much to character whatsoever either. So after that, he gets this musical gig, and he gets to play at Sudum's place, right? This is the character from The Horror at Red Hook, as Lovecraft wrote it. The strange thing is here, and this is when it really was illuminated to me that Lavalle does not get horror. At least he does not get horror in the way I like to perceive horror. So he goes over there, he gets this gig, he sees all these strange books, he starts to witness some things that Robert's up to. And what does Robert do? Well, he just kind of explains everything. He explains the horror of the unknown to this man and his plot and his plans and everything he wants to do and how it's going to unfold, and it's kind of ridiculous. I don't even think this is the midpoint of the story. It's maybe in the first third of the story, and you're like, okay, usually horror hinges on a mystery of some kind. It hinges on the unknown, and that's what draws us in. That's what gives us a sense of dread as this thing unfolds. But Lavalle gives it to us right out of the gate. Terrible idea. It was a huge disappointment to me. But you can kind of see why he was doing it. He was trying to get part of the story out so he could hit the point of transformation, because we are dealing with a novella here. This book is only about 150 or so pages long, which I think it was probably too big of a story that Lavalle was trying to tell for the page count. I'm all for novellas, but I think what Lavalle was trying to do just wouldn't work in this length. And as I mentioned, we hit a point where Tommy's role changes, right? His archetypal role changes in the story. And I did like that aspect of it. It kind of became hokey, though. It kind of became really cheesy. And I'll read a line once we talk about the writing to hopefully show you exactly why I felt that way. But once Sudam sort of divulges all of this stuff, Tommy gets mixed up into it. He disappears, right? He goes through this kind of strange character transformation of sorts. And then we get into Malone's head. And then these two stories, Malone's and Tommy's, converge at the very end. So on one hand, I really do like the idea of taking a story that existed, seeing it through or telling it through a different lens, but then still respecting the source material. So while Lavalle was doing that more or less, it didn't feel that way. It didn't feel like horror. And it also didn't feel like a deep character exploration, which I feel like that's what he was trying to do, which leaves us with not much to hold on to. So let us talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. I wasn't quite sure what Lavalle was trying to do here, because the writing is extremely plain, which isn't a bad thing, right? It had kind of a pulpy feel. Wasn't trying to get too flowery, which was definitely in direct opposition to Lovecraft's prose, which is very dense, very hard to read. You have to have a lot of patience to get through it. But for some reason, the way he writes in his archaic way, it fits the content. It fits the concepts of what he's exploring. And I think that's why it always worked for me. It almost feels like you're reading some ancient text, literally written by some guy from a long, long time ago. And so because of that, it immerses you in the story. Whereas Lavalle went the extremely simple route, which I can appreciate, again, because it's far more readable. But what doesn't it do? What doesn't it do? It never creates a horrific atmosphere. It never builds the dread. It never does all of the things I love about the Lovecraft mythos, which is a big problem because this story is based off a Lovecraft story. So I could only imagine people would have certain expectations, myself included, when approaching this story. Now, you could argue that Lavalle was not trying to create a Lovecraft story, and that's fine. All of the criticisms I still have hold true. Bad characterization, no empathy, terrible use of horror being the lack of horror, giving away the horror, what the unknown is in the first third of the novel. And to top it off, some very cheesy writing. The thing I was most curious about was getting to the end, because at the very end of the story, in the horror at Red Hook, right? It's very familiar. It's a very familiar trope with all of Lovecraft stories, right? You got to have the reveal. You got to show the monster. You got to show what drove this character mad, or what this character saw. And that was by far my favorite part of the horror at Red Hook, because Lovecraft usually has a knack of giving you enough and not giving you too much, because he understands the lack of detail oftentimes is where the horror lies. So how is Lavalle's writing, his simplistic writing, going to convey this? It did not. As I said, there's no horror. There's no revelation. There's no staring into the abyss of unimaginable horror in this book whatsoever. It was never conveyed to me in that way. So let me give you an example of the writing here. You could probably argue it's a little bit of a spoiler, so if you don't want to read it or don't want to hear me speak it, you should skip to the next part. So this is a part of the story where Malone is finally confronting Tommy Tester. "I'm an officer of the law. Don't you understand the consequences if you hurt me? Guns and badges don't scare everyone." "How?" Malone asked. "How can you do all this? If not for power, then what could be the point?" "I bear a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wish to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin." "You're a monster then," Malone said. "I was made one." So, pretty cheesy, right? It fits into the pulp nature, I think, that Victor Lavalle was trying to create here, but it's too on the nose, too laughable, right? This is laughable. I can't imagine anyone saying these words outside of a comic book. Yet here we are in a novel that presumably Victor Lavalle is trying to get us to empathize, to care. He's drawing us into the story from a character perspective. If you're trying to get us to care about people and make us feel that they are real, you cannot have lines of dialogue like this. In a comic book, totally fine. In a pulpy story that is all about plot and not about character, totally fine. In this, based on my interpretation of what Lavalle was trying to do, it did not work for me at all. Which is why I'm gonna give The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Lavalle a 6 out of 10. A riff on H.P. Lovecraft that hits more wrong notes than right ones, as if composed by Tommy Tester himself, with characters you never connect with even though that is the entire point of the story, with writing that is too plain for its own good that never evokes any horror whatsoever, which I'd argue is kind of the point of a horror novel. So yeah, I've heard a lot of good things about this author, about this book, and unfortunately it was not for me. It was not good. I felt like it failed on far too many accounts. There was some great stuff that Lavalle was playing with here. Again, he's trying to bring deeper characterization to Lovecraft. He's trying to play with our expectations of what a protagonist or what a hero is. All of those things I loved, but he just never made it work on the page for me. I never felt it. And creating empathy is one of the most difficult things to do in writing. And often it is what is driving us to stay with the story, right? We care about what happens to this character. And Lavalle was truly trying to make that the center of the story, but it just did not work. Well, that is it for me. Hope you enjoyed the review. If you've read The Ballad of Black Tom and disagree with me, let me know in the comments below. Or if you agree with me, I'd love to hear that too. If you'd like to check out my own work, my own novels, you can check out the link in the description below. And thanks for hanging out with me, and thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.